So, I made a sequel to Half-Life Opposing Force. Well, I made a series of renders based on a basic plot outline that I wrote. Unfortunately, this isn't an actual game that you can play. Regardless of what form this project is, I thought that this could be a fun thought experiment that I could share with everyone. Before I get started with the video though, only 4.5% of my viewers are subscribed, so be sure to subscribe, as you can always change your mind later. With that out of the way, let's get right into Opposing Force 2. And, as always, thank you for watching. Off the bat, let's get this out of the way. Do we really want to call this game Opposing Force 2? I mean, that's what this game is, but I think the title's a bit long and cumbersome. I think we can do better. So, basically every Half-Life game has some sort of reference to science as a concept or term in its name, right? Like how a half-life is the time it takes for half of a radioactive thing to disintegrate. Blue shift is related to light or something like that. And opposing force could reference magnetic forces or something like that. You get what I'm talking about. While the short but simplistic title Opposing Forces could work, especially considering there are more than one forces against our protagonist in this game, but I feel like that's just too close to the previous game's name. Honing in on forces though, specifically magnetic forces and their repulsion between similar poles, could give us the name Half-Life Repulse, which I think works pretty well. It also has the prefix of re, which can refer to going back to something like we're revisiting an old game, perhaps. I think Half-Life Repulse has a good ring to it, so now let's get to the meat and potatoes of the video, the plot of Opposing Forces sequel. First off, we will be using the same protagonist from Opposing Force, Adrian Shepard. In case you're watching this and aren't familiar with the plot of the original Opposing Force, Adrian is a member of the United States military. He and other members of the Hazardous Environment Combat Unit, or the HECU, were tasked with killing anyone and everyone affiliated with the Black Mesa Research Facility after they opened a portal to an alien dimension. Adrian was marooned in Black Mesa and left to fight for himself, being put into stasis at the end of the game by G-Man, the closest thing to a god in the Half-Life universe that we've seen so far. As is tradition with the Half-Life 2 trilogy, I wanted to open up this game on a G-Man monologue. Repulse opens on G-Man waking Adrian from stasis, explaining to the HECU soldier that he's being released back onto Earth. Later I'll get into the reasoning for this, as it's a bit confusing, but here's an AI reading out this monologue.
Corporal Shepard, I don't mean to disturb you, but I have been tasked with notifying you that your indefinite hospitality with us has come to an end. My employees have made the executive decision to, well, downsize ourselves and our organization. While this may come as a shock to you, I can personally attest to it being no fault of your own. You were and have continued to be an ever so interesting byproduct of the Black Mesa incident. While you will no longer be affiliated with us, I will observe you from afar for a little longer. I want to see that tenacity, that survival instinct, that adaptability once more. But for now, Corporal, this is where you get off.
After this, Adrian finds himself in a subway station, not unlike the one that we start at in Half-Life 2. We, the player, would take control of Adrian at this point. However, after being given mere seconds to move and look around, there's a loud explosion as a headcrab canister crashes through the ceiling, implanting itself into the floor in front of us. Several more crash down and destroy the support structures of the subway station, collapsing it onto us as the screen goes black. Eventually, we wake up and pull ourselves from the rubble. Looking up, we're 2 floors down from where we were left by the G-Man. We're in the subway itself now, although any direct exits to the surface are blocked off by rubble, because of course they are. There's a nearby wrench, which we collect to do some sort of puzzle, like turning off a gas pipe or something. And now that we have a wrench, which can be our first weapon, we continue into the subway depths, searching for a way out. As Adrian moves through the long, since abandoned hallways, rooms, and tunnels, he finds out that the subway is infested with head crabs and their zombie counterparts. Dealing with a few zombies at once is more than possible due to our wrench being a fairly solid melee weapon at this point, but any more than 3 at a time can be difficult to handle. Thankfully, we find a dead Combine, the current alien rulers of Earth, and a gun. Adrian arms himself with it and presses onwards. After passing through several collapsed walls and questionably safe halls, we find ourselves in the sewers. They're much more densely packed with headcrab zombies, having some much faster variants in here as well. Even with this new pistol, Adrian has a hard time dealing with these amount of headcrabs. Pushing through the zombies as best he can, Adrian finds himself face to face with the horde of the shambling monsters. On the other side of them is a way to the surface via a collapsed road. Thankfully, a voice calls out to Adrian, telling him that help is on the way. A group of Good Samaritan citizens open fire on the zombies, clearing the way for us to make it to the surface. They seem to have mistaken us for one of the Combine, on the account of Adrian's outfit being somewhat similar to a generic Metro Cop. Regardless, they help him out of the sewers and take him to a nearby building. Believing Adrian to be Combine reinforcements, they explain that their city, designated as City 15, is suffering pretty badly from the ongoing conflict between the Resistance and the Combine. To the surprise of any veteran Half-Life fans, the majority of City 15 actually submitted to Combine rule pretty early on. They generally embraced their leadership and continued on under their totalitarian rule. Due to this, the citizens disapprove of the rebels and their fight against the Combine. Your helpers justify themselves by noting how City 15 is the site of a major ongoing battle between the Resistance and Combine forces. Most of the city is destroyed from this war, so anti-resistance sentiment is at an all-time high. Regardless, the citizens wish you luck helping the cause. To help navigate the broken-down city, they give you a spare sledgehammer that was lying around. They bid you farewell and leave you to wander the desolate streets of City 15. The sledgehammer would be one of the key mechanics of Half-Life Repulse, as its ability to break down weak surfaces in 2 to 3 swings gives the player huge potential to change enemy encounters to their favor. The hammer's effects can be as simple as knocking down a wall to get a new vantage point, or as complex as knocking down a support beam for a building and causing it to collapse onto your enemies. Since the Source Engine is known for its revolutionary physics sims, especially at the time of its release, I feel like this mechanic is a natural next step for player interaction, especially with something as combat-heavy as a sequel to Opposing Force. Plus, it'd just be super satisfying to do a huge swing of the hammer and kill an enemy in one shot. After all, it is a sledgehammer we're swinging around. Back to the game itself, we're off to explore the barren City 15. The atmosphere is bleak as hell, with soot and dust in the air and gunfire in the distance. Everything seems on the verge of collapse, giving us ample time to figure out the ins and outs of the sledgehammer. As we move through the streets, we encounter a small rebel party. They make the same mistake the citizens did, believing us to be a stray Combine soldier. They open fire on us, forcing us to shoot back in self-defense. This marks the first time that we ever actually fight the Resistance in the Half-Life universe. As we continue through the city, dealing with another few Resistance parties, we're descended upon by Combine forces. They've heard the increase in fighting and tracked us down. However, they don't make the same mistake as their adversaries, opening fire on Adrian. This marks the first Combine-centric shootout of the game. With how action-packed the original opposing force was, I want to take the action up to an 11 for its sequel. I felt the best way to do this was to completely isolate the player and have him be without help for the majority of the game. It's quite literally one man fighting against an entire city who doesn't know him, yet wishes him dead anyways. And this is where the majority of the game is played. Adrian moves through the city on what's essentially an action-packed roller coaster. In terms of set pieces that I have throughout the game, I definitely want one in an abandoned residential building. Just tearing through apartments with gunfire and your sledgehammer. I think another could be on an elevated highway, fighting off rebels or Combine on both sides, forcing you to duck behind cars for cover and stuff like that. A park-turned-detention camp could be cool, or a hyper-industrialized factory in the style of the Half-Life 2 beta could be an awesome reference. And if you're thinking that this all sounds like a lot of action, it would be, but this game wouldn't be without its downtime. I'm imagining this hypothetical game as a way to show the Half-Life universe's biggest war from a new perspective. I want to really hone in on the visuals of how conflict has ravaged City 15 and show that even though the Resistance are objectively the good guys in the world of Half-Life, they'd still be seen as terrorists to the Combine and their few but plenty sympathizers. While the game would definitely be a power trip at heart, the quieter moments would be just ever so haunting. Something like finding an abandoned teddy bear in a child's room, a pair of skeletons holding each other, or a view from a high-rise overlooking the battle-scarred burning city. Returning once more to the game's actual plot, Adrian would fight in battles growing in scale until he eventually comes across a concerned citizen. He begs Adrian not to shoot him before realizing that Adrian isn't a Combine. He tells us that the Combine are starting to pull back from the city, despite having been winning most of their shootouts. The citizen explains that he thinks he overheard directions calling for a bombing run of the city, and that everything is going to be wiped out soon. The citizen tells Adrian that there's a safe way out of the city not too far from his building. There's a train yard that leads into a huge forest that's generally not occupied by either Resistance forces or the Combine. It isn't exactly safe, but it's better than dying. After pointing us in the direction of our escape, he bids us good luck, gives us a combat knife for good measure, and sends Adrian into the final act of Half-Life Repulse. As we make our way to the train yard, we don't encounter many threats. A couple headcrab zombies here and there, but nothing else. There's ample resources and ammo for the weapons we found along the way, gearing us up for our final battle. Once we make it to the train yard, we realize that we're going to have to make it through an in-progress firefight between Rebel and Combine forces. Everyone's firing at everyone else. Rebels shooting at Adrian and the Combine, Combine forces shooting at Rebels and Adrian shooting at Rebels and Combine alike. It is absolute, pure chaos. Once you're about halfway through the fight, an attentive player would be able to notice G-Man watching from the forest's edge. He finally got to see Adrian's adaptability and tenacity one more time. Satisfied, he leaves the scene. Seemingly on cue, the roar of helicopters and explosions enter earshot. While this massive firefight has been going on, the bombing of City 15 has started. Resistance forces and Combine alike stop fighting for just a moment to look on in horror as the Combine helicopters and warships rain hellfire down upon the city, approaching them all. By now, Adrian has about a minute to navigate the obstacle course-esque maze of the train yard and make it to a tunnel before the battlefield is completely obliterated. Screams and explosions fill the air as you run away from it all. Just as you're about to make it to the tunnel, a helicopter drops a bomb behind you, which detonates and knocks you out. Waking up battered, bruised, and clinging on to life, Adrian makes his way through the tunnel, unable to sprint anymore. He finds himself in the forest the citizen told him about, which any Half-Life fan would correctly identify as White Forest from Half-Life 2 Episode 2. Adrian makes his way into the trees, it being devoid of anything but nature. The sky behind us is blazing and filled with smoke, but ahead of us is a woodland bathed in a peaceful twilight haze. It's a direct contrast from the final battle we just fought through. At this point, there are no more enemy encounters. The game basically turns into a short walking simulator set in White Forest, which was always one of my favorite locations from this franchise. We're free to explore a small area that culminates in a path that turns into a cliffside hike. If at any point Adrian has his wrench out, as opposed to anything else in his arsenal of deadly weapons, a bird can fly down and perch on it for a minute or so, giving you an achievement before it leaves. As Adrian makes his way to the top of the hill, we find a small cabin tucked away in the woods. The doors cracked open, inviting us in. The small house was left to nature's devices long before the 7-Hour War, hence the state of it. Approaching the cabin, we can hear some sparse gunfire. At this point, we're given an opportunity to either disregard the fighting and enter the cabin, or investigate the shooting. If Adrian chooses to walk into the cabin, the game ends and the credits roll. However, if he looks over the edge of the cliff, he can look down and see the end of a mine shaft in a valley. In the valley, a group of antlions and their alpha are fighting against a single man, launching rocks, barrels, and explosives at them with seemingly cracks of lightning. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Gordon Freeman, the main character of the Half-Life series. You can watch the fight as long as you want until Gordon kills the antlions and leaves, leaving Adrian with the game's conclusion, same as before. We walk into the cabin, our sight fades to black, and the credits roll. This project, Half-Life Repulse, means a lot to me. Not only is it set in my favorite game series of all time, but it's also a sequel to a beloved spin-off that truly deserved some sort of conclusion. I was inspired to make this by the release of the demo for the Through the City mod, another fan-made sequel to Opposing Force. I also haven't made anything in SFM for quite some time, so I figure I'd play around, make some concept art, make a rough plot, and just have fun with it. Also, to finally explain G-Man's opening monologue, Half-Life Repulse is set during the events of Half-Life 2 Episode 2, but it's also leading up to the events of Half-Life Alyx. To elaborate, the G-Man from Episode 2 goes back in time to set in motion the events of Half-Life Alyx. Repulse is essentially G-Man leaving Adrian in that original timeline of Half-Life before Half-Life Alyx changes the timeline. It's all a bit confusing, but think of it like this. G-Man and his employers don't really want any loose ends carrying over into their new timeline, and Adrian Shepard is arguably more combat capable than Gordon Freeman, the biggest pain in the history of pains in their asses. In order to avoid dealing with him in their new timeline, G-Man leaves Adrian in the original timeline. Still confusing? Yeah, I'm sorry. Half-Life Alyx is still a bit weird to figure out in terms of its story placement, but regardless, this project was just fun as hell to make. I haven't actually sat down and written a story from start to finish in quite a while, so this was just a great exercise to ease myself back into writing and world building. Since I had so much fun creating this side story for Adrian Shepard, I would love to make another video like this for another project. I've been considering doing something like continuing some of the stories from the Left 4 Dead games, or doing a similar mock-up for a Half-Life game based on Barney Calhoun, aka a spiritual sequel to Half-Life Blue Shift, another Half-Life expansion. Hell, I could even make a project based on my version of a Half-Life 3 if people wanted. I'm just saying. Basically, what I'm saying is I'm open to suggestions for making this a potential series on my channel. Leave a comment below with an idea for a game, or movie I guess, that I can make a spin-off or continuation of, and I just might make that into a video. But, with that out of the way, I think it's time we get off this train ride. I've got more stories to make, and you've got more stuff to watch, presumably. And hey, if you watch this far, why not subscribe to my channel? It would really mean the world to me. And, as always, thank you for watching, and have a great rest of your day.